I used to believe trust was something you earned slowly at work. You showed up on time. You delivered what you promised. You stayed late when things went wrong. And eventually someone higher up noticed. That's how it worked for me. Or at least, that's what I thought. I had been with the company a little over 7 years, mid-sized firm, not a startup, not a dinosaur, the kind of place that talked a lot about culture and ownership, but still tracked every dollar like it was coming out of someone's personal account. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. I was the guy they called when a project started slipping and nobody wanted to be the one responsible for pulling it back. That's how I ended up managing the Phoenix rollout. Phoenix wasn't glamorous, but it was expensive. A long-term infrastructure upgrade tied to several high-value clients. If it launched on time, it would quietly stabilize a third of our revenue stream for the next 2 years. If it failed, there wouldn't be a dramatic collapse, just a slow bleed that everyone would pretend not to understand. The approved reserve for Phoenix was $199,000, not my number. Finances, legal signed off. The board approved it in one of those meetings where half the people were muted and the other half nodded without reading the deck. The reserve existed for one reason only: emergencies, vendor failures, compliance changes, unexpected security work. It was not a bonus pool, it was not a slush fund, and it was under my name. My manager, Greg, made a point of emphasizing that, in front of people. Your budget, he'd say during reviews. Your call, he'd say in meetings. Your responsibility, he'd remind me, smiling whenever deadlines came up. Greg had a way of smiling that made things sound supportive, while quietly shifting weight onto your shoulders. He wasn't incompetent. Worse, he was careful. He rarely wrote emails that committed him to anything. He preferred hallway conversations, quick calls, verbal approvals followed by, "You've got this." At first I took it as confidence. The first 3 months went smoothly. We came in under forecast on 2 milestones. Vendors delivered early. Finance sent me one of those rare emails that ended with, "Nice work, keeping costs tight." I forwarded it to Greg. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Then one Tuesday morning, the reserve dropped. I noticed it by accident. I was reconciling invoices before a steering committee meeting, checking burn rates against the dashboard. I refreshed the page, thinking the system had lagged. It hadn't. The reserve balance showed 38 out 614s. I stared at it longer than I want to admit, ran the report again. Same number. That meant over $160,000 was gone. I pulled the transaction log. My name was still listed as project owner, but the authorization trail didn't come from my credentials. It came from Greg's cost center override. Multiple transfers. Clean. Approved. Documented just enough to pass a surface check. Expense codes were vague. Operational alignment. Resource reallocation. Executive support. I walked straight to his office. Greg didn't look surprised when I asked. "Oh yeah," he said casually, leaning back in his chair. "I had to move some things around, temporary." "From the reserve?" I asked. He nodded. "You weren't using it." "It's not discretionary," I said. "It's there in case." "I know what it's there for," he interrupted, still calm. "And trust me, this helps all of us." I asked him where the money went. He smiled again, the same smile. "Leadership initiatives," he said. "You don't need to worry about it." That was the moment something shifted. Not panic, not anger, something quieter. Because if the project failed now, there was no buffer, no margin, no room for reality to interfere. And the documentation, the budget responsibility, the forecasts, the risk acknowledgments, still pointed to me. Greg stood up, clapped me lightly on the shoulder and said, "You're doing great work. I appreciate the trust." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "And let's keep this between us. No need to confuse finance." That night, I went home later than usual. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't vent to anyone. I sat at my kitchen table and replayed the conversation again and again. Not for what was said, but for what wasn't. He hadn't denied the risk. He hadn't documented the transfer, and he hadn't moved my name off the project. That was when I understood something I wish I'd learned earlier in my career. Trust, in a corporate setting, is often just exposure with better branding, and I had just been handed all of it. For the next 2 weeks, nothing went wrong, and that almost bothered me more. The Phoenix rollout kept moving forward, but every decision felt heavier now. Every vendor email, every change request, every line item I approved came with the same thought in the back of my mind. If something breaks, there's nothing left to catch it. I adjusted forecasts quietly, trimmed timelines where I could without raising alarms. I renegotiated a support contract myself instead of escalating it, just to save a few thousand. On paper, the project still looked healthy. In reality, it was running without a safety net. Greg, meanwhile, became more visible. He started dropping into meetings he'd never attended before. Steering committee calls, cross-team syncs, even one client-facing check-in, where he introduced himself as closely involved in Phoenix's success. He spoke confidently about strategy, about alignment, about leadership commitment. He never mentioned the reserve. When finance sent out a quarterly variance review, Greg forwarded it to me with a one-line message. Make sure Phoenix stays clean. Eyes are on this. That was when the irritation set in. Not because of the pressure, I was used to pressure, but because the situation was becoming asymmetrical. He had moved the money, taken the benefit, and left me with the liability. And now he was positioning himself closer to the surface, where things looked good. I requested a formal budget rebaseline. Nothing dramatic, just an email to finance asking to document the reallocation and adjust the risk profile accordingly. Standard procedure, protective even. Greg called me within 10 minutes. Why are you stirring this up? He asked. I'm not, I said. I just need the numbers to reflect reality. He exhaled, slow and controlled. Look, you don't want finance poking around this. It creates noise, and noise attracts the wrong kind of attention. So what happens if we hit an issue? I asked. There was a pause. Then we solve it, he said, like we always do. He didn't say who would solve it. The call ended politely, but the message was clear. Don't escalate. Don't document. Don't protect yourself. The next week, a vendor delay hit. Nothing catastrophic. A compliance review ran longer than expected, pushing the deployment window by 10 days. Under normal conditions, I would have pulled from the reserve, paid for expedited validation, and kept everything on track. Instead, I stared at the numbers and felt my stomach tighten. I sent Greg a brief message outlining the options and the cost. His reply came an hour later. Let's absorb the delay. No extra spend. The delay triggered penalties. Minor ones, but real. Then came internal friction. Teams reassigning resources, shifting priorities, quietly blaming Phoenix for the disruption. I started hearing my project mentioned in meetings I wasn't invited to. Then came the performance check-in. Greg scheduled it under the subject line. Quick sync. It wasn't quick. He pulled up a dashboard I recognized, the one I maintained. He pointed to the timeline slippage, the narrowed margins, the increased dependency risk. These trends, he said carefully, could raise concerns. I flagged the root cause, I replied. We had a reserve for exactly this. He nodded slowly. Yes, but leaders expect adaptability. There it was. The implication that I hadn't adapted, that I hadn't managed the risk. I left that meeting with a strange clarity. This wasn't miscommunication. It wasn't pressure. It was positioning. That evening, I logged back into the financial system, not to change anything, but to observe. I pulled approval chains, access timestamps, cost center mappings. I cross-checked them against company policy, the kind nobody reads unless something goes wrong. Greg had used an executive override tied to a temporary authority extension from the previous quarter. It was still valid, barely, and it expired in 31 days. That was when I stopped trying to fix the situation and started documenting it. I saved every report, took snapshots of access logs, downloaded policy PDFs, and highlighted the sections on reserve usage, authorization scope, and project accountability. I kept everything offline, time-stamped, untouched, because I had begun to understand the shape of the trap, and more importantly, the timing. I didn't know it yet, but that 31-day window was the last thing protecting him, and the first thing protecting me. The first real break didn't come from a meeting or an email. It came from silence. 3 days passed after the performance check-in, and no one followed up. No action items, no revised plan, no written concerns. On the surface, Phoenix was still considered on track, even though every person involved knew it wasn't. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. Greg wasn't trying to fix the project. He was letting it drift. And drift, in corporate terms, is useful. It creates ambiguity. Ambiguity creates plausible deniability. I stopped volunteering explanations. In meetings, I stuck to facts, dates, numbers, dependencies. I removed emotion from every update. If someone asked why a buffer was thin, I said, "The reserve was reallocated earlier this quarter." I didn't say by whom. I didn't editorialize. No one challenged it. They just nodded and moved on. One afternoon, I received an automated notification from finance. Upcoming authority expiration. It was addressed to Greg. I wasn't copied, but I could see it in the system. A reminder that his temporary cost center override would expire in 12 days unless renewed with executive approval. That explained his confidence and his urgency. The next morning, he called an unscheduled meeting. Just the two of us. "I need Phoenix stabilized," he said, closing the door behind him. "We can't afford surprises." I asked what he meant. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "If something comes up," he said, "we'll need to show decisive leadership, clear ownership, no confusion." I understood him perfectly. He was preparing to transfer risk upward onto me. That night, I reviewed the company's incident response playbook. Buried deep in the documentation was a clause most people ignored. In the event of a material project failure involving reallocated reserves, finance was required to initiate an independent review of authorization trails. Not optional, mandatory. The review wasn't triggered by intent. It was triggered by impact. That was the moment everything clicked. I didn't need to expose Greg. I just needed the process to run. 2 days later, the vendor issue escalated. The compliance delay triggered a contractual review from one of our largest clients. They requested formal assurance that the infrastructure upgrade would meet revised standards. Providing that assurance required additional testing, additional spend, the kind the reserve was designed for. I documented the request. I forwarded it to Greg with a neutral summary and a single question. "How would you like to proceed?" He replied within minutes. "Proceed without additional spend. We'll manage the optics." I saved the email, then I sent a formal risk notice to finance. Not an accusation, not a complaint, a notice. I outlined the client request, the lack of reserve, and the potential financial exposure if timelines slipped further. I attached the relevant policy excerpt on reserve usage and escalation thresholds. I CC'd legal per protocol. The response came faster than I expected. Finance scheduled a review. Greg called me immediately. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I followed procedure," I said. "The reserve is gone. The risk threshold was crossed." There was a long pause on the line. "You've put me in a bad position," he said finally. I almost laughed. For weeks I had been carrying a project with no safety net, absorbing pressure, adjusting expectations, and quietly being positioned as the eventual fall guy. And now, because I had refused to improvise reality, he felt exposed. That night, I realized something else. I hadn't broken trust. I had outgrown it. They thought I was still managing a project. I wasn't. I was managing the consequences. And once finance stepped in, those consequences were no longer negotiable. The finance review didn't arrive like a confrontation. It arrived like weather. Quiet, methodical, unavoidable. An invite appeared on my calendar titled Phoenix Financial Clarification. No names attached. No agenda beyond 3 bullet points. Greg was included. So was legal. So was an executive controller I'd only seen once before, during a reorganization that quietly removed 3 directors in a single afternoon. Greg walked into the meeting smiling. He opened with confidence. Talked about dynamic allocation, about short-term optimization, about how leadership sometimes had to make difficult decisions to support broader priorities. No one interrupted him. Then finance spoke. They didn't ask why the reserve was reallocated. They asked how. Authorization trail, timestamp, scope, duration, renewal request. Greg's answer slowed. He pulled up slides that weren't requested, spoke in generalities, referred to verbal approvals and implied understanding. When asked to name who had approved the extension, he hesitated, just long enough to matter. Legal leaned in. Was this reallocation documented as a temporary loan or a permanent transfer? They asked. Greg said it was contextual. Finance asked for the documentation. There was none. That's when the tone shifted. Not hostile, precise. They reviewed the policy aloud, the section I had highlighted weeks earlier, the one that stated that project reserves, once approved, could not be reassigned without updating the project risk owner of record. That name was still mine. Greg tried to pivot. He pointed to the delays, the vendor issue, the tightened margins. He implied that poor execution had necessitated executive intervention. I was asked to respond. I didn't defend myself. I didn't accuse him. I stated facts, dates, transactions, emails, the denied request for additional spend, the risk notice sent after thresholds were crossed. I showed that every decision had been documented, escalated, and acknowledged. Then finance asked a question Greg hadn't anticipated. Why was the authority extension not renewed? Greg blinked. The extension had expired 2 days earlier. Silence followed, the kind that isn't dramatic, but definitive. The controller closed his notebook. This requires a broader review, he said, effective immediately. Greg didn't look at me after that. The fallout wasn't instant. It never is. Chaos in corporate environments moves slowly, then all at once. Budgets were frozen. Access rights reviewed. Senior leadership pulled into one-on-ones that ran long and produced no summaries. Rumors circulated, but no one could say exactly what was happening. Only that Phoenix was no longer my project. 2 days later, I was reassigned. Not sidelined. Reassigned. Phoenix was placed under interim oversight. I was moved to a different initiative, one with a clean scope and clear sponsorship. No explanation was given. None was needed. Greg disappeared from meetings. At first, people assumed he was busy. Then someone noticed his calendar was empty. Then his name stopped appearing on approval chains. The official message came the following Friday, a brief announcement about leadership restructuring and compliance alignment. Greg was thanked for his contributions and wished success in future endeavors. No farewell email, no send-off, just gone. That evening, I walked out of the building feeling lighter than I had in months. Not triumphant, not relieved. Clear. The chaos had passed through the system and done what systems do when allowed to function. It corrected itself. And for the first time since Phoenix began, the burden I'd been carrying was no longer mine. The week after Greg left, something unexpected happened. Nothing. No urgent meetings. No late-night calls. No quiet pressure to circle back or align offline. Phoenix continued under interim oversight exactly as it should have from the start. Boring, procedural, accountable. Finance reinstated a revised reserve. Legal documented everything retroactively. The vendor delay was resolved through standard channels, paid for by money that was finally allowed to exist again. The project didn't need heroics. It never had. I watched it from a distance, no longer responsible for steering it, but close enough to recognize how little drama real work requires when the rules are followed. The same people who had once nodded along in vague meetings now asked direct questions. Decisions were written down. Approvals had names attached to them. Reality restored. A few colleagues reached out quietly, not to gossip, not to celebrate, just small messages that said things like, "I'm glad that worked out," or "That couldn't have been easy." One person admitted they'd noticed something was wrong, but hadn't known how to say it without risking their job. I understood that more than I cared to admit. A month later, I was called into a meeting with the controller. Not an investigation, a conversation. He thanked me for handling the situation professionally, said it had saved the company from a much larger issue down the line, asked if I'd be open to taking on a different role once things settled. Not a promotion, an opportunity, one that came with defined authority, documented scope, and a sponsor whose approvals appeared in writing. I accepted. There was no celebration, no moment of vindication, just a quiet sense that the weight I'd been carrying had finally been put down. I thought back to the day Greg smiled at me and said, "Thanks for the trust." At the time, it felt like recognition. Now I understood what it really was, a test. Not of loyalty, of awareness. I didn't win by outplaying him. I didn't win by exposing him dramatically or forcing a confrontation. I won by refusing to absorb responsibility for decisions I didn't make, and by letting systems do what they are designed to do when someone stops interfering. That was the lesson that stayed with me. Trust isn't silence. Responsibility isn't blame. And professionalism doesn't mean protecting someone else's shortcuts. Sometimes the most effective move is the quietest one. Document, wait, and step aside. The rest takes care of itself, and when it does, there's nothing left to say. Just a clean desk, a finished project, and the calm that comes from knowing you didn't bend yourself to fit someone else's mess.